Welcome to Tech to Tech presented by KYZEN, where we will explore common cleaning questions and answers. Let's get started. I would like to introduce KYZEN's own Eric Bromley.
Thank you, William, and welcome everyone to today's version of KYZEN's Tech to Tech series. Today we're going to be talking about corrosion and rust protection. And when I say corrosion, it's really both for oxides for ferrous materials, oxides for like aluminum and some stainless steels, and also ferrous materials like iron and steel, things of that nature, and also darkening of copper and brass. But today we're going to be talking mostly about just good old-fashioned rust on steel. And when I refer to it as a CP or an RP, CP meaning corrosion protection and RP meaning rust protection. Here at KYZEN, we technically use the terminology of corrosion protection. So throughout here, you'll be seeing CP. Some of the topics we'll cover today are how does rust happen? Process changes to minimize rust, both in process methods and applied separately. You can do both and they can both be equally effective. So how does rust occur? Well, mostly it occurs in aqueous processes because of the introduction of water. That's really no surprise to anyone. It can happen in some solvent processes as well, but it's not as often as with an aqueous process. When the parts are left exposed to the environment, it can also rust quite a bit. Humid environments, we'll talk about that a little bit further, but that is the biggest contributor to it. Also, the location of the cleaning process itself, where the machine is located within the building or within the facility, can play a big part on how things rust and how quickly they rust. And the performance of the dryers can also play a big part. If the dryers that are in your system are not set up correctly, if they're a blower type dryer and they're not positioned in the right angles, or they're not hot enough or not enough pressure, then they may not completely blow off any of the excess water. Excuse me, and any excess water left on the part will dry and rust. So that can be a big player as well. Also, if you have a chamber type heater dryer, if there's no place for the air and the moisture to go in the chamber itself, like an exhaust or through a filter, then it'll dry the part. It'll just rapidly rust in the chamber. So as I said, rust will form wherever water remains on the surface. And so it's key to get that water off the surfaces. It can be difficult, especially in the corners and blind holes and the fine pitch threaded areas of the machines, of the parts rather. That can be very difficult for a blower type dryer to get into. So it may take a little extra time, or positioning or even rotating the part while you're drying can make a big difference as well. Where the contact area with similar materials, the picture to the right shows that a pretty good representation of multiple materials all in contact, and they're all rusting and corroding at pretty much the same rate. Latent heat of the material itself can also be a contributing factor. If the parts come out of the wash and the rinse cycle and they're really very hot, they have a tendency to flash the moisture off, and that can cause rusting as well. It can cause spotting too, but today we're talking about rusting. And if the parts are left in storage too long, that's probably the most common reason for these parts to rust in general. If they're not protected well enough and they're left outside storage or in a non-humidity controlled environment for too long, they will rust. There's also partial and spotty rusting. There's not just surface rusting all across the material. It can be spots in areas. One of the most common causes of this is the cleaning chemistry not working correctly. If you're seeing spotty rusting or certain areas on a large surface where you're seeing rusting, and then there's some areas that are not, that's an indicator that the cleaning chemistry, the cleaning process that you're using is not adequately removing all of the oils and the soils. So there's some areas that are not as clean as others. There's rust fade areas. It's not always necessarily a spot. It can be a discolorization on parts, especially with aluminum. You'll see a little discoloration on certain areas that can be rust and corrosion. Inconsistent surface rust, what I had previously referred to, was if you had a big flat surface or a long sheet, there could be some areas on that part will have a little bit of rust and some areas won't. So it's very inconsistent and can be tricky. In the end, some of the parts that can rust will have issues with fitment, where if you have a machine part or very close tolerance parts for engines or brake parts or transmissions or aerospace, they very much rely on a machine surface for a good seal. And if rusting starts to develop in these areas, then it can cause performance issues and ultimately even part failures. Some of the other factors to consider with rusting is the high relative humidity in shops. As many of us are aware of, the um, the the metal fabrication shops are very rarely are they air conditioned, so you're subjected to the heat and the environment that the building is put in. So there's a lot of open doors and fans pushing air around inside the building for operator comfort and to remove some of the heat. But that can also bring some of the humidity and some moisture, and it'll settle on the parts. If the cleaning process happens to be located near an etching or a passivation line, then the boiling tanks, that moisture can transfers over, and as it cools, it'll settle back down onto whatever it wants to, and it can be your parts, and that'll cause rusting. So if you have a mysterious rusting in a certain area and it happens to be one spot of the building versus the other, that's the likely cause. It's being this moisture is redeposing from another operation. And as we know, rust can develop immediately or over time. As I mentioned, the parts come out of the process, and if they're very hot, the water can flash off, and that can cause rust before you can get it to um, put some corrosion protection on it. Some of the areas where you can minimize the rust is to completely dry and protect the parts. It's not always that easy to do that, but that is probably one of the best ways to do it. Process the parts in a humidity controlled environment. That's very difficult to do because many of these processes are very high volume and they're on the production floor, and there's a lot of equipment moving around and it's in line. So to put it all in a humidity controlled environment would be difficult and very expensive and just not practical many times. Handling clean parts with gloves is important too, especially with some of the very sensitive surfaces I had mentioned, the machine surfaces. Just the finger oil on your hand can cause rusting. It looks like a snowflake or a starlight kind of a rust, and it'll quickly migrate to areas you don't want it to be in. Don't excuse me. Don't allow any clean parts to touch each other. That's also key. As they touch each other, and right at that point of contact, moisture can form, and it can start to rust there. And as I mentioned before, to be mindful of nearby aqueous process locations. That can be a problem that is kind of difficult to fix. Um, it is very difficult to completely eliminate rust in human environments because of the humidity, and for the reasons that I just spoke about, it can be very difficult. It's key to use a cleaning chemistry with a CP built into the formula. That's one of the easiest ways to do it. So as you're washing, when the parts come out of the wash cycle, they already have some corrosion protection on them that's built into the cleaning formula. Or you could add a CP into the final rinse stage so that as the parts leave the final rinse, they come out and they have this micro level of protection on them. It's dry film or wet film. Those are the two typical types. There are also standalone CP tanks for added protection, and these would be a more of a wet gun oil type of protection, where after the parts were washed and rinsed and dried, you would take the parts over to this tank and immerse them for just a quick second or two for a dunk and a swish, so to speak, and then you allow the parts to drip dry, and that would be the extra protection. Using VCI bags and oil and wax paper for stacking parts. Those are very common, but sometimes part configuration or size just doesn't make that possible. And if you have a VCI bag and you put a part in it that's still wet and you seal it in the bag, it's going to rust in the bag. So that goes back to my comments about how the cleaning process and the drying can play in a big part of eliminating rust. So as I mentioned, for aqueous processes, there's wash chemistries with the built-in CP formula. Those are very common, and they're very effective. You can add a CP into the rinse tank. There's the separate water displacing long-term CP dip tank process that is common for overseas travel in long storage. For solvent processes, there is also an added CP process that can be added to the cleaning process. And this is for a solvent vapor degreaser, vacuum vapor degreaser, where there's a separate tank where you can add a CP at the end of the wash cycle. And then for the more standard open top degreasers, there's a separate dip tank process that I mentioned where after the parts are clean and dry, they would be dipped. And once again, for some of the different process for aqueous wash, combination wash and CP is really most effective. It's multi-metal safe, and some of them that are available in the market don't even require a rinse. So you can wash the part and let it air dry and drip dry, and it has the CP protection right on it. There are some products that you can actually you can paint right over these products as well. So there is it's probably the most effective. The rinse tank additives, there are different types. There's amine-free, there's the dry film that I mentioned, and there are others that are also approved for air freight. There are different requirements for corrosion protection that's used for air freight because of the concerns about flammability and solvent flashing off. So if you do have air freight parts, make sure you use a CP that is approved for air freight. And the solvent processes that I had mentioned, the hydrocarbon and modified alcohol processes, those systems would have a separate CP tank where after the wash, rinse, and dry, you program the machine to perform a CP additive. So it just basically injects it into the tank so the parts are protected, and then it comes out. And the water displacement is the dip tank process that I had referred to, where the parts are immersed in the tank and then allowed to drip dry, and they have like a wet film on them. So, in conclusion, when it comes to manufacturing, the summer heat is not always good. It's for some parts of the country, it's nice to have the summer heat back, but with it comes a lot of problems, and rusting can be one of them. Be mindful of the area around your cleaning process. As I mentioned, the open doors and the fans and the cooling and the passivation lines and the acid dip lines, those can cause quite a bit of moisture to be put into the production area, and that can cause rusting as well. Parts handling and storage concerns, you can save quite a bit there, minimize a lot of the rusting by just being cognizant of how you handle the parts, how you store them, and optimize the drying temperature. That's very effective, a very effective method of removing any issues with the rust, the dryer temperature, and the positioning of the blowers and things of that nature. And I use a chemistry with an added RP. That's one of the most common solution that we see is to just have a chemistry with an added RP, and it does a really good job. So some of the frequently asked questions that we get on this topic is, once the CP is added to the part, will it affect further processes? Generally, the answer is no. It doesn't affect anything as far as fitment issues or any kind of further machining, or if you're doing any kind of further processes to the parts. If you are checking the parts for size and you're using very sensitive micrometers and things of that nature, sometimes the CP, depending on the percentage that it's on, sometimes that can throw it off a little bit, but very rarely. Can I apply a CP when I'm cleaning dissimilar metals in the same bath? Yes, you absolutely can. The CP will protect everything, the ferrous and non-ferrous parts. It won't affect the fitment of any of the parts. It won't affect the color or anything of that nature. So it's fine. And the last question is there an easy method to remove rust once it appears on the surface? There are multiple methods. It's aqueous dip process seems to work the best. You would have to use an acid that would remove the rust. So depending on the type of steel or metal that you have as a substrate, it would determine what you use to remove the rust, but it can be done. And if it's on heavy enough, or if it's bad enough, then you may want to consider a tumble or a media blast or something along that nature. But usually it can be removed through an acid process. And those are that's ends my presentation today. So thank you again for your time, and I will turn it back over to William.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you all for watching this Tech to Tech session. If you would like to discuss this topic further or have any questions not answered in the session, please contact your local KYZEN regional manager or send an email to tech@KYZEN.com, and we will have someone follow up with you as soon as possible. And if you like this video, be sure to follow us on our social media platforms for more expert cleaning content.